XYZ will come out of the woods and get you. These deal around gods or divine figures, which were there to help understand universal questions. That there was also a boom in the Victorian era where the printing press was mechanized. He married his young cousin Virginia Clem, who was only 13.
Why?
Literally.
Why?
Moving on, women were not really recognized or legally allowed to become publishing professionals and escape literally the world wars. And he was so immersed into writing this book, he asked for multiple extensions, and it also made Dungeons and Dragons really popular. They no longer have H.P. Lovecraft as like their price image because of his like controversial. Let's take a look at the history of fantasy books. I think that is such an interesting thing to see where stories come from and kind of where this fantasy genre started. So obviously it starts out with like mythology and folklores, which were kind of these stories to teach lessons or to carry like history around. For example, Egyptian or Greco-Roman mythology, and usually we're often made up to teach kids a lesson like, oh, if you don't do this, like XYZ will come out of the woods and get you. And stories were mostly shared from mouth to mouth, which is also why there are so many different twists depending on the person you talk to, and why there are also like really similar lores that are found in faraway countries. Like if you look at like Chinese folklores, you will also find like really similar aspects to I Got Told in Germany. Another big part is that, for example, myth always deal around gods or divine figures, which were there to help understand universal questions that kind of everyone has, like where do we come from, how was the world created, etc. And so these were created to kind of answer these questions and to create also safety and a sense of belonging. They're kind of different thoughts on what is like the first ever fantasy thing, but one interesting thing I found, which was kind of depicted as this oldest written work, which is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which was written on clay tables in Mesopotamia. And it deals with like a heroic quest for immortality where the main character confronts gods and monsters, which is like the fantasy genre, so really cool. And just in general, in these older times, stories were usually told to kind of give vital information and share that with your village, like, oh, this and this happened to me, and like this was dangerous or something, or this is what I learned from it, and to kind of share like realistic advice. But this then kind of like shifted from sharing these like religious cultures, like warning ideas, to the creation of like fictional situations for just entertainment or artistic value. And what came to my mind immediately were the legendary tales of King Arthur, which were first coined by Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1138. That's so early. But these Arthur stories were also kind of like what I thought were the first fantasy lores. But also interestingly, like Robin Hood from 1377, which is like crazy. I didn't know it was this old. But in general, like besides this shift, there was also a boom in the Victorian era where the printing press was mechanized. So it was much easier to print stuff. And also like made up stories were used for political and ideological purposes. And then in the 1800s, like the classic stories came along from the German brothers Grimm and also Hans Christian Andersen. I think that's like unknown. Those are known people. Then we have Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein in 1818, which is often considered like one of the earliest big works of science fiction. And her novel blends like gothic and fantasy elements, and she really laid the groundwork for future speculative fiction as a female author in the male-dominant genre on that time. So it was really groundbreaking, and I think it's cool. I want to include all these cool women that often go unnoticed. Then in 1832, George Sand wrote romantic and adventurous tales with fantastical elements, and she was one of the first women to challenge gender norms in her writing, and she also paved the way for like future female authors in speculative writing. Interestingly, in 1838, Lady Charlotte Guest, also a woman, translated or published the first English translation of the Mabinogion, which predated like these Arthurian legends also. So then in 1845 we reach another milestone. It was kind of the rise of the dark fantasy through The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. And to be honest, I've always heard the name, but I never knew like who he was. So a little bit about him. By 1835 he was in Richmond as an editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. And they kind of made a name for himself as a critical reviewer, and he married his young cousin Virginia Clem, who was only 13.
Why?
Literally? Why? Anyways, he was really interested in romanticism with the occult and the satanic. So this was kind of reflected in his character's duality, the eeriness, the grotesque, and this path of the beyond. He also drank a lot and had a lot of brain lesions. And yeah, so this whole time really like influenced him. And I think like if you feel free to read his like biography, it kind of makes sense why dark fantasy kind of rose through him. Then the first book that was kind of considered fantasy for adults, because before that we mostly had this like fairy tale thingy, and which also the authors from Masterclass say that this is kind of the first book, because before that most of them were kind of like believable, or people weren't as aware that it was like fantasy. And this was Fantastis, which was written by the Scottish author George MacDonald, and it was a fairy romance for man and woman, which features a young man who's drawn into a dream world where he has a series of adventures. And it is also said that this kind of influenced Tolkien and Lewis in their later works. So then in 1865, Lewis Carroll writes Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which he wrote during a repressive Victorian age, which is also why pretty cool, because this is like the first time there was a female protagonist without a male companion, and also a big start of isekai, which is where a character enters a new world through like a mystical door. So in Alice's Wonderland, she enters through this rabbit hole and then finds herself in this like new magical world where she has her adventures. Another book that is kind of considered the first medieval fantasy novel is written by Englishman William Morris, who wrote The Well at the World's End. Kind of broke ground in the genre by completely inventing a fantasy world that like existed beyond our known world. And I think it's so interesting to see where like the first lores and tropes came along that are so normal to us nowadays, you know? And it's so cool to see like who was the first one to kind of write it, or where it started, or who inspired who. Moving on, women were not really recognized or legally allowed to become publishing professionals until the late 19th century, so like 1800s end. They wrote before, I mean, I mentioned a few again, but it wasn't like a recognized profession, and there are still so many male authors who cannot deal with women being in their literary space. Like, I just saw this TikTok of an author, I will put it on here, who wrote like tweets on where she explained her like interaction with male authors. Bro, what is your deal? Literally, what is your deal? How can you be so insecure that another person comes along and writes books and goes onto these panels with you because just readers love reading their work, and you're like, what are you doing here? Like, I'm so insecure of my own work that I have to put others down. Then the next milestone is kind of the golden age of fantasy, which was in the first half of the 20th century, so beginning of 1900. and where it was coined as weird tales, amazing stories, or fantastic adventures, like kind of the keywords. There we had books like The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from the 1900, Peter Pan from 1905, which created the Lost World, where characters accidentally stumble across an ancient world which is hidden beneath their own. Then in 1902 we had Five Children and It, written by E. Nesbit, and this featured children that discovered magical creatures and artifacts, and it was one of the first modern writers to integrate magic and everyday life, which also influenced the later children's fantasy literature. So, awesome woman again. Then from 1920s and the 1940s, there was another boom of this genre because of using entertainment as a form of escape. Literally, the world wars would do the same. Then in 1926, like during that time, we had Blood in the Mist by Hope Mirrlees, which combines fantasy with elements of social satire, and it was considered a precursor to the modern urban fantasy subgenre, and it also influenced authors like Neil Gaiman. So then in 1937, which was also in this boom, we got The Hobbit, which was kind of the birth of high fantasy. In 1954, we got more and more books which featured more of personal conflict and mystical encounters, and this is like really where the fantasy genre term was kind of coined and like got its own category. Then in 1915, we got The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which mixed traditions of fairy tales. It was also more a low fantasy beginnings. Amazing book, love it. Then in 1961, The Iliad was written. It was and still is really popular because it gives a lot of deep insights into our history, and it's more than a mythological tale, but also revealed details on the conflicts on the Trojan War, ancient Greek culture, literature, and religion. And I got into the Iliad when I read The Song of Achilles, which I really loved. And it is a really cool book, so I think it's definitely worth mentioning this year. Then in 1963, we got Witch World series by Andre Norton, who created a richly detailed world blending science fiction and fantasy elements, and Norton's success demonstrated that female authors could thrive in the fantasy genre, and she influenced a lot of future writers. Then in 1968, I think this is also a title you probably have heard, A Wizard of Earthsea, I think I have it somewhere here, by Ursula K. Le Guin. And she introduced a complex, diverse fantasy world with deep philosophical underpinnings, and was also kind of like a milestone in the fantasy genre. In the same year, we also got Dragonflight by Anne McCaffrey. The series was one of the first to blend science fiction and fantasy with a focus on dragons and telepathic bonds. She was also the first woman to win both the Hugo and the Nebula Awards, which are like fantasy book awards. Then in 1979, Michael Ende wrote The Never-Ending Story. He's a German writer. And it's a really, really cool story. And he was so immersed into writing this book. He asked for multiple extensions. And it also made Dungeons and Dragons really popular. Then in the 1990s, we got the epic series from Terry Goodkind's The Thwart of the Truth. We also got George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, who, continued to release his volumes well into the 21st century. During that time, we also got the Wheel of Time series, which is considered one of the greatest achievements in epic fantasy. It was written by James Oliver Rigney under the pen name Robert Jordan, and then the last 3 books were completed by Brandon Sanderson because the author got, I think, some disease. And what makes it so good is that women are actual characters.
What?
Like, they are characters with personalities. And it's different from most post-Tolkien. And whilst there are monsters in there, it is more of like a human tale. And people, like, readers love it because there are so many details and because the story is so, like, well written and climaxes through this entire series. So I think it's definitely on my list. I think I have it on my Kindle because my brother read it, but I definitely also want to read it. And yeah, again, I just love finding out the books that really like. Then in 1997, we got Harry Potter, which transformed the book industry and created this global fandom from all age groups. It also revitalized the interest in the genre and inspired a new generation of readers and writers. Same. Then 1001 Arabian Nights came along in 2000, in the year 2000. Actually, it has a crazy long story, and it started really early. Like, here's an entire article where they kind of explain how everything started, when the stories were added on, because it didn't start out by so many stories. And it's all about word of mouth, manuscripts being translated and then moved from point to point. So yeah, the more of the final versions are like now from the year 2000, and the most known by us, which are like Aladdin or Alibaba or Sinbad, love the anime by the way, were like added much later. Then in the 21st century, there was the explosion of many subgenres, and everything was getting more diverse. We got Aragon, Twilight, The Vampire Diaries, Shadow and Bone. Lastly, before we end this video, I just wanted to mention a few awards that are out there. This was also the first time I knew about awards. It kind of makes sense that there are awards, but I never really like looked for them. But actually, I think the websites are kind of like a cool thing to find new books and to get inspiration. So one of those is the Hugo Awards. I already talked about it. It's probably one of the most prestigious and talked about fantasy and science fiction award. It's named after Hugo Gernsback, who was the founder of a science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories. And so then he kind of started annual literary awards for the best science fiction or fantasy works and achievements. Lately there have been like a few discrepancies and scandals going on there. Honestly, I'm not surprised. So if you're interested in like a longer video on like awards and their vote tampering, their fraudulent votes and censorship and human rights abuses, tell me. Then also there's the World Fantasy Award, which started out in 1975. So that was like the first year when they started to give out those. It's for all subgenres, and you can apply from everywhere from the world, but the author has to be alive. Like, something I always kind of look at is how they like deal with certain things. And like a positive thing to say, they no longer have H.P. Lovecraft as like their price image because of his like controversial things in his book. Apparently there's just a lot of racist shit in his books, and I'm glad they took it out. Why would you want a racist author to be the image of your award? And then there's also the British Fantasy Award, which started giving out awards in 1976, and it mostly focuses on fantasy and also accepts all books in English from all over the world. It started out with just one award, and now they have 16 different categories. I see a lot of like Stephen King, Ramsey Campbell, Sarah Binborough, sadly not. In 2011, they also had allegations on unrightful criteria, where they weighted towards like small presses rather than mainstream publishing. And yeah, they gotten a lot of criticism that genuine quality is not really reflected. And a lot of the awards were also given to Telos, which was a press that was co-run by the coordinator of the British Fantasy Awards. Jesus Christ, why is it so difficult to have companies that have like a moral value system? But yeah, so these are some noteworthy awards I wanted to mention. I think it's just interesting to know a little bit about this. And I lied. This is not the last part of this video. I think this is the perfect part to go into more social issues before we really get into the world building and the tropes and cliches and blah 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 blah, because it is really important to talk about. I already mentioned that in general women had it kind of harder, or still have it hard, to be in this space. Being a woman of color makes it even harder because of both gender and racial biases. So you have 2 lottery tickets. There's also like a lack of representation in the publishing industry because they're received as less marketable. What are you talking about? There's also a lot of probably gatekeeping, of unfair biased rejections, or their work being heavily edited to conform to more familiar and mainstream narratives. Because why would we want different point of views? Like, this would definitely not add really important but also really interesting and diverse stories. Like, why would we want that? We only want Western mainstream stuff. Another reason why this is an issue is because they often receive less marketing support and promotion. There are also a lot of genre expectations, like people with non-European or non-Western background will incorporate obviously their backgrounds in a way that doesn't align with the genre. According to some people, like, what does it even mean? It's literally fantasy. It is literally fantasy. What are you talking about? But yeah, I highly recommend looking for books written by diverse authors. And in general, where can you find like diverse books or books by diverse authors? One I found was Diverse Book Finder, pretty obvious. It's like an online resource that provides a searchable database of children's books featuring diverse characters. Then we have the Brown Bookshelf, which is a website dedicated to highlighting African American authors of children's and young adult literature. Then we have Solaris Books, which is an imprint known for publishing diverse voices in science fiction and fantasy. And yeah, just click through the website, maybe you'll find something interesting. I think it's just worthy to support, spread your reading repertoire. Yeah, so that's kind of it. We talked a lot about what the history of the fantasy genre is. I think we've learned really interesting things. So yeah, if you want to and you enjoyed this video, please like it. And yeah, subscribe me if you don't want to miss out on any of the videos on this fantasy book genre deep dive. Or just in general, if you're interested in movie themes, book themes. I don't have anything more to say. So, see you next time. Bye. Okay, I didn't record this. Oh my god. Well, whatever. I'll just include my audio. So, okay. Deep philosoph with deep philosoph